Welcome back. It's useful to start this video by locating it in the module. The overall goal of this module is to illustrate how people manage as part of a complex system. You don't manage in a vacuum. Rather, there are a number of constraints that you need to be aware of as you manage people. The previous lesson focused on trying to illustrate the range of those constraints. Now, in this lesson and the next, we're going to focus on the legal environment more specifically as an important part of the set of constraints. Now, when we get to lesson 3, we'll talk about some specific laws from the United States, from Europe, from other places to illustrate things. But I think this will make more sense if we spend some time in this lesson laying more of a foundation. How does the law look at the employment relationship? We saw in the previous two modules that workers don't necessarily see the employment relationship as a purely economic transaction. But what about the law? Does the law see the employment relationship as simply a commercial transaction? Now think of a commercial transaction. You can typically buy whatever you want from whomever you want at whatever price the two of you agree on, and you can stop whenever you want. Suppose I want to buy some old records. I can buy as many records as I want from whomever I want, as long as we can come up with a mutually agreed upon price, and I can stop buying records whenever I want. But what about employees? Can workers do the same? Can workers work for whoever they want, whenever they want, at whatever compensation they can obtain? Can they quit at any time? What about on the organizational side? Can organizations simply hire whoever they want, whenever they want, at whatever compensation and other terms workers will agree to? And can they fire workers for any reason at any time? If the answer to all four of these questions is yes, then we call that a system of employment at will, sometimes just called at-will employment. Employment is at the will of the employer and the employee. When this is the case, the organization can change the terms of the employment relationship with no notice and no consequences. For example, an organization can change wages, terminate benefits, reduce paid time off, require workers to work overtime or weekends on short notice, and terminate a worker at any time for any reason. Employment at will is an important benchmark. From an organizational standpoint, it's probably ideal because it means that a manager can manage without outside interference. Well, almost, if we think back to the previous lesson and remember that their social norms, community expectations, and other factors can still be important. Since employment at will is often seen as the ideal legal benchmark, at least from an organization's perspective and from the perspective of free labor markets, it can be viewed as a measuring stick against which to compare various regulatory regimes. And I'm using employment at will in this lesson as a functional benchmark for you to think about what you can and cannot legally do as a manager. That is, it's useful to start from the simple case of where you can hire and fire at will, and then ask, where do you face limitations? Are there limitations in hiring certain workers? Do you have to fulfill mandated standards for pay, such as a minimum wage or overtime premium? Are there other required terms and conditions of employment? Are you only able to fire workers for certain things? So for both of these reasons, employment at will is an important legal benchmark as well as an important functional benchmark. But does it actually exist? So from the worker's perspective, can workers, again, work for whoever they want, whenever they want, for whatever compensation they can obtain? And can they quit when they please? In countries that we would consider free and democratic, the answers are yes. But this hasn't always been the case. For several centuries in Britain, workers were still legally seen as servants with typically 12-month contracts. Until the late 1800s, they were still being criminally convicted for leaving before the end of their contract. This illustrates the fact that the employment relationship is a special type of commercial transaction. Today, the Walk Free Foundation estimates that there are 35 million people trapped in modern slavery, so there are still way too many abuses in practice, even when workers are legally free. But in countries that we would consider free and democratic, workers do have the legal freedom, at least, to work for whoever they want, whenever they want, at whatever compensation they can obtain, and quit when they please. What about on the organization side? Can organizations hire whoever they want, whenever they want, at whatever compensation other terms workers agree to, and fire workers at any time for any reason? Well, we're going to talk about this more in the next video, because this is really quite a complicated set of questions. For now, we'll just say the answer is yes, but not without limits. So employment at will does exist, but within certain boundaries. Some of these boundaries are geographic. Employment at will is much stronger in the United States than it is in much of the rest of the world. Some of these boundaries around employment at will are more functional in nature. So for example, you can't discriminate on the basis of race, but you can discriminate on the basis of what football team someone supports. So as long as you're within these appropriate boundaries, employment at will exists. So it's useful to start thinking about the employment relationship as a voluntary contractual relationship. Again, within boundaries, that's largely how the law sees it. On the worker's side, it's critical to remember that workers can quit at any time. So as a manager, that's very important to remember because you need to be responsive to workers' needs and preferences. But don't fall into the trap of thinking that the employment relationship is a purely voluntary contractual relationship, just like buying records. It's not. You cannot simply hire as many workers at whatever price you want, under whatever conditions you want, and fire them at any time. There are boundaries. Because the employment relationship involves people, it's a very special relationship. Employment at will is an important concept to start from. It's an important benchmark, but true employment at will does not exist. That will be the subject of the next video.